Okay, picture this. It's April 13th, 1970, and you're traveling through the terrifyingly quiet, pitch-black expanse of deep space. You're roughly 55 hours into what has honestly been an incredibly smooth flight. The hum of the instruments is steady, the crew is relaxed, it's almost mundane in its absolute perfection. Everything is going exactly to plan. And then, out of nowhere, a violent, shuddering bang echoes through the metallic hull of your spacecraft, instantly triggering a master alarm.
Welcome to our explainer, Apollo 13, the triumph of survival. Today, we're breaking down one of the most astonishing, high-stakes crisis management scenarios in human history. So often, we think of space exploration in terms of flawless calculations and these historic firsts, right? But this story? It's the absolute gold standard for something much more relatable. It's about what happens when literally every single system you rely on catastrophically fails, and pure human ingenuity is the only thing standing between life and death.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, A Bang in Deep Space.
Houston, we've had a problem. That loud, shuddering bang, it was the sound of a routine procedure turning into an absolute nightmare. Basically, a wiring flaw had sparked a fire, and an oxygen tank completely exploded inside the service module. And guys, this wasn't just a minor glitch, it was the loss of the spacecraft's lifeblood. The explosion blew the side right off the module and damaged their second oxygen tank. And because those tanks fed the fuel cells, the spacecraft was rapidly losing not just its oxygen, but its primary source of electricity and water, too. This unprecedented cascade of failures resulted in arguably the most chilling understatement ever broadcast back to Earth. Houston, we've had a problem. Let that sink in for a second. They weren't just delayed. The meticulously planned mission to the lunar surface was officially over, and their very survival was instantly on the line.
Which brings us to Section 2, 200,000 miles from home. The sheer, terrifying reality of their isolation really comes down to one massive number: 200,000. The astronauts were over 200,000 miles away from Earth. To put that into perspective, an emergency down here on Earth usually means an ambulance or rescue chopper is on the way. But out there, orbital mechanics dictate the rules. You can't exactly just hit the brakes and pull a U-turn in space. They were hurtling toward the moon at thousands of miles an hour. Help is absolutely not on the way. There's no rescue ship. They are entirely on their own, completely surrounded by an unforgiving vacuum, trapped inside a rapidly dying spacecraft. In the math they were facing, it was, quite frankly, a death sentence. Failing resources across the board, limited power, limited water, limited oxygen. They had to evacuate the dying command module and basically use the lunar module as a lifeboat. But here's the catch. The lunar module was only designed to keep 2 men alive for 2 days. Now, it had to keep 3 men alive for 4 days. They faced this impossible interplay of failing resources. To conserve what little power they had to shut down nearly every system, which dropped the cabin temperature to near freezing. And that limited water, it wasn't just for drinking, it was actually required to cool the ship's electronic systems. If those electronics overheated, they would die. And worst of all, they were bleeding limited oxygen. It became a terrifying ticking clock, where every single breath literally counted against them. Okay, moving on to Section 3, The Cardboard and Tape Fix.
Back on the ground in Houston, NASA engineers had mere hours to figure out a fix before it was too late, because one of the most immediate, deadly threats wasn't actually running out of oxygen, but suffocating from their own exhalations. The carbon dioxide levels in the lunar module were rising to lethal levels. Now, the command module had plenty of CO2 scrubbers, but there was a massive engineering problem. The command module scrubbers were square, and the lunar module system only took round scrubbers. It was the ultimate square peg in a round hole dilemma. And the reality of their solution is just staggering. Engineers locked themselves in a room with only the specific items the astronauts had on board. That's right, the materials used for this life-saving solution relied on cardboard, plastic bags, duct tape, and a few spare spacecraft parts. High-tech, multi-billion-dollar space exploration literally meant absolute, desperate DIY.
The execution of this fix played out as the ultimate exercise in remote teamwork. Step 1, NASA engineers built this makeshift, kind of Frankenstein-looking contraption on the ground just to prove the concept would actually filter the air. Step 2, the astronauts copied every single step up in space. Just think about the monumental hurdle of this communication for a second. You have exhausted, freezing, dehydrated astronauts whose brains are sluggish from carbon dioxide buildup. And the ground team had to verbally guide them through a complex, multi-step engineering build over a crackling, static-filled radio connection. Yet meticulously following those instructions, with their lives hanging in the balance, they built the rig. and thankfully, the carbon dioxide levels finally began to drop. Now we enter Section 4, holding our breath.
Against all odds, the improvised air filter worked. But man, the ordeal was far from over. This kicked off an agonizing, chronological thriller. Because they couldn't just turn around. On day one of the crisis, the heavily damaged spacecraft had to use the moon's gravity to slingshot completely around it, using that momentum to begin its long trajectory home. Then, it was a brutal, freezing, 4-day wait. On day 4, they finally hit Earth's atmosphere for re-entry. And this was an incredibly dangerous maneuver. The angle of re-entry had to be absolutely perfect, too shallow, and they'd skip off the atmosphere straight back into deep space. Too steep, and they'd burn up. Plus, no one even knew if the initial oxygen tank explosion had cracked the heat shield on the bottom of the command module. If it was compromised in any way, they wouldn't survive the 5,000-degree heat of re-entry. Minutes later, everyone was desperately waiting to see if those parachutes would open.
The world held its breath. As the spacecraft hit the atmosphere, a standard communications blackout occurs due to ionized plasma building up around the ship. Usually, this lasts about 3 minutes, but for Apollo 13, it stretched past 4 minutes. For those agonizing extra seconds, the entire world held its breath. It wasn't just NASA. Millions of people, globally, united in a state of pure suspended animation. It was this unprecedented global media event where humanity simply stopped, waiting, listening to static, and praying for those parachutes to deploy. And then, finally, through the radio crackle, a voice, and the visual of 3 massive canopies opening over the Pacific Ocean.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, NASA's greatest success.
Obviously, the original mission to land on the moon was abandoned, but history views this event entirely differently than a failure. There is such a stark contrast between reaching the moon versus bringing everyone home alive. Reaching the moon is a testament to exploration, to mathematics, to perfectly executed plans. But bringing the crew of Apollo 13 home safely, that became NASA's greatest success, specifically because, in the face of absolute disaster, they flat-out refused to accept defeat. They shifted from a mission of exploration to a pure mission of survival in a heartbeat, demonstrating the absolute peak of human resilience, adaptability, and collective problem-solving. So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. Is ultimate success about reaching your goal or surviving the unexpected? We all set trajectories in our lives, right? But sometimes the systems fail. When you face your own exploded oxygen tanks, your own sudden massive crises that throw you entirely off course, do you define your success by that original plan or by your resilience in making it through? The story of Apollo 13 reminds us that sometimes our greatest triumphs aren't found in the destinations we reach, but in the disasters we manage to survive. Keep that in mind the next time you face the unexpected.